I've been super excited to make this video because I get a ton of questions pretty regularly about my night photography process, and a lot of those questions are actually pretty similar. So I wanted to sit down and just talk through my night photography journey. I've shot photography at night now for a couple of years at least, and I've definitely gotten some images that I really like. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that I've learned throughout this process that might be helpful for you. Night photography can be incredibly challenging, especially for somebody new to the genre, and it can pose a lot of questions. What type of camera should I use? What lens do I need? Should I bring a tripod? What are the settings that I have to use? These are all things that when I first started, to be honest, I was a little bit overwhelmed by. And so I wanted to make this video just to talk through some of the lessons I've learned over the last couple of years. And hopefully you guys will get some takeaways that you can bring to your own workflow to improve your night photography. I want to emphasize that these are lessons I've pulled from my personal journey, and so they may not all work for you, but for me, they were definitely helpful. That said, I want to get right into it, and the first thing we're going to talk through is gear. Night photography is one niche of photography where sometimes the gear that you use actually does matter a lot. And going without certain gear in certain situations can actually make or break your ability to get a good shot. Overcoming low light and still getting a decent exposure is going to be one of the most important aspects of the night photography process. In general, there are a couple of pieces of gear that, depending on the situation and depending on your style of shooting, will probably end up being essentials, and they're ones that you're going to want to consider adding to your kit. First things first, we want to talk a little bit about lenses. A prime lens, something with a maximum aperture of f2, f1.2, something like that, it's going to be really helpful when you're shooting subjects in low light. The lens can actually open up wider, so again, it allows you to gather more light. Now, in my experience, a prime lens is an absolute must for situations like concert photography or street photography at night. Let's look at concert photography, for example. You have a really fast moving subject and you're dealing with a low light environment. You're inside a venue and you're basically relying on the lighting that they set up. You want to capture the movement of that performer on stage. You want to freeze that action, but you also want to make sure that you're gathering enough light because again, you're in a low light environment. And so the solution is to toss a prime onto your body because you can use a lower aperture. You can shoot at, f2, f1.2, gather enough light to get a good exposure while still using a shutter speed that can freeze the action of the scene. I mentioned again street photography at night. If you're shooting anything fast moving, you want to freeze the moment, but you also need to gather enough light to actually get a good exposure. Shooting with a prime lens is going to help you do that. It's going to allow you to use a lower aperture and a higher shutter speed at the same time while still being able to get a good exposure overall. Now, there are workarounds if you don't want to buy a prime. Of course, there's always a workaround for everything. The most obvious for this would be just to use a tripod because then you can use those longer shutter speeds. And we're going to talk about tripods in a second. But assuming you want to stick with a handheld setup, you can also just increase your ISO. Other options include still using, a slightly slower shutter speed and maybe leaning on something, but you're less likely to be able to freeze action at that point. And so if your goal with the image is to prioritize freezing the action, you're going to want a prime lens in your kit. As for focal lengths, I really don't want to harp on this too much. Me personally, I do prefer things on the wider side. For a prime lens, I'm usually using a 23mm from Fujifilm. That's my favorite lens right now in my kit. But I'd recommend you just try out a variety of focal lengths, get your hands on as much as you can get your hands on. Over time, you'll develop a taste or, just like a preference for different looks. And once you develop that taste, it'll help you make a decision about what prime lenses you think you need to have in your kit. Next on the list of essentials is an obvious one for night photography, a tripod. Tripods are an absolute necessity if you want to do any long exposure photography. So basically, if you want to do an exposure longer than, I would say, like 1/15 of a second, you need a tripod because you need some extra stability just to keep your camera from shaking. When photographing places like suburbia or a lot of the rural landscapes that I'll shoot at night, I actually treat them like landscapes. And so oftentimes I'll use a higher aperture, something like f8, for example, because I want to get as much of the scene as I can in focus. I also like to use lower ISOs if I can, just because it keeps the images a little cleaner. So this is why for me and the work that I shoot, a tripod is definitely a non-negotiable in my kit. For 99% of my photos, I absolutely require it because I'm doing longer exposures. A lot of the suburban neighborhoods that I've photographed were very dim in person. So they require really long shutter speeds to actually get a proper exposure. And especially again, when I'm using a lower ISO or a higher aperture, I'm gonna need as much extra light as I can get. A tripod would also be a recommendation of mine for anybody shooting cityscapes or astro, or if you're doing like any type of light trails, you know, cars on highways, that sort of thing. You can try to do this stuff handheld, and you may in some cases actually come away with a good image, but honestly, having the stability of a tripod is just gonna open up so many doors when it comes to the settings that you can use. So again, my recommendation, even if you're not gonna shoot that much with it, I would still recommend having one in your kit. Just to kind of summarize things, in my experience, both of the things we've talked about so far are essential in some situations. Having a prime and a tripod is a good idea. However, I almost never use them at the same time. Pretty much the only scenario I can think of where I would absolutely need both would be astrophotography, like if I'm shooting the Milky Way or something like that, but that's not something I really do. For 99% of the scenes that I'm shooting, I am on tripod, so I actually don't even use a prime either. Most of the time I'm using this guy right here. This is my favorite lens from Fujifilm. It's the 10-24 f4. So it's got wider focal lengths, and honestly the max aperture, it's not that low. So it's not a fast lens at all, but because I'm on a tripod, I really don't need the flexibility of a prime lens because I'm gonna use longer shutter speeds anyway. And I'm using an aperture of like f8 for most of those, you know, suburban neighborhood scenes. For street photography at night, or really just any fast moving subject in low light, so a concert or a show, something like that, I'll use a setup something like this. It's the Fujifilm X-T3, so simple body and a prime lens. I have the 35 f2 on this right now. This is a great setup for, again, Times Square, or, you know, just street photography at night in general, or maybe sneaking this into a show and getting a photo at a concert, something like that. At the end of the day, the gear that you use doesn't really matter that much. What matters is that you use the right gear for the right situation. This all said, this is coming from the perspective that I have shooting night photography. This is just kind of what works for me. You might find that you need both. You might find that you don't need either. It really just depends on what you're shooting, what your preferences are, and, you know, what you're comfortable using. The settings that you use for a photo really should be based on kind of two things. The first thing being the intention of the shot. Are you trying to focus only on a subject? Like, do you want the background to be blurry? Are you trying to get everything in focus? Are you trying to have a lot of depth to the image? Do you care about noise and grain? Do you want to freeze action? Are you okay with moving objects looking blurry? These are all things that you have to think about going into shooting a photo. And then the second thing is the actual situation. How bright is the scene? Like, what is the exposure you're gonna require? And this is obviously true for really all types of photography, whether you're shooting at night or in the middle of the day. You're still gonna have to think about all of those things going into shooting a photo, but it's definitely of the utmost importance for night photography, where getting an exposure is already a challenge. This all said, I do have sort of these go-to settings. These are just examples from very specific scenarios that I've been in, but hopefully they'll be helpful for you and give you some insight into how you can go about picking settings yourself. For me, there are sort of like two camps of night images that you could take. The first is gonna basically be, you know, street photography at night, a low light subject that moves quickly, that you wanna freeze the action of. And the second is those slower, still moving, like they're not really moving scenes, more like landscapes, things like suburban neighborhoods, cityscapes, stuff like that. In those scenarios, you're not really freezing action, you're more just looking to capture everything in focus, and you just wanna get a bright, clean exposure. Looking back at that first camp, you know, the fast moving subjects in low light, I often use a handheld setup and just rely on the prime lens. I showed you in the previous section, basically just go out with this if I'm shooting like Times Square, for example, or a concert, something like that. Oftentimes I might use settings like 1/125th of a second, f2.8 for an aperture, and ISO 1600. If I'm walking around Times Square, that should be generally sufficient for, you know, a lot of the scenarios I'm going to encounter there, because it's fairly well lit, but it is still, you know, a night scene. It's still pretty dark. And so I do kind of lean on that prime lens having a little bit more flexibility on the aperture side to give me a little bit more light. That shutter speed, you know, being around that 1/125th of a second area, settings like that will allow me to focus on, you know, a specific subject. I'll still get a good exposure, but I'll also be able to freeze some of the action in the scene as well. If I can, when I'm shooting handheld, I also try to cap my ISO somewhere around 1600. I sometimes push it pretty high. Like, there are images I've shot at 6400 if I have to. I mean, the number one thing that I prioritize always when I'm going out to get a photo is the exposure. So if it requires a crazy ISO, I'll use a crazy ISO. It is what it is. For these slower, darker scenes that I'm shooting in suburban neighborhoods, in cities, wherever I'm exploring, when I want to get those landscape looking images, I'm always using a tripod. I almost never shoot them handheld. And so using a tripod obviously opens up a ton of doors regarding settings. I can use way longer shutter speeds to get much better exposures. And typically when I'm on a tripod, my minimum exposure is multiple seconds long. I'm also using higher apertures, so that just kind of adds to the fact that I need to use a longer shutter speed. And then again, I also cap the ISO as well around 800 or so typically. All of those factors add into the fact that the tripod just allows me to use that longer shutter speed and get a really solid exposure even with those tougher settings and that dim light. Let's take a look at this scene here. For example, I shot this on a tripod with my Canon 6D, used a 10-second exposure, an f8 aperture, and ISO 800. Now, if you're wondering why I was using a Canon 6D, I think I just shot it a couple of years ago. This was before I started using Fuji, but I used pretty much the same settings on images shot on Fuji as well. Now let's go back to that image we were talking about. The f8 aperture allowed me to get just about everything in the image in focus, which you can obviously see. The ISO of 800 kept the image from being too noisy, and then to maintain the exposure, I just used a 10-second shutter speed, which was long enough to gather the light that I needed. Now let's take a look at this image. I took this one with very similar settings. I used an aperture of f8 to get a lot of depth, and ISO 800, so it's not super noisy or anything. However, in person, the scene was actually a lot darker than it looks, and it required a way longer shutter speed of 30 seconds. Across a lot of my night work, I'll usually just lock in the f8 aperture and typically that ISO of around 800. And from scene to scene, as I take photo to photo, I really only adjust the shutter speed to maintain a proper exposure. I found that this has actually been really helpful from a workflow perspective, because when you're using a tripod and you're trying to find scenes to shoot at night, it's already such a hassle and there's already so much work involved. And so it's nice to just eliminate the thought around, the aperture and the ISO, and to only have to worry about using the shutter speed to get, the proper exposure. So it's partly helpful on the workflow side of things. The other thing that I noticed though with this is that I think it's giving my work a more consistent look to use similar settings across the board. And I think this has been helpful for me as I've started to figure out how to develop, a style with my night photography. In general, when it comes to settings, if I could give you an overview of my approach, it's that for fast moving subjects, I typically prioritize my shutter speed because I want to freeze that motion. So I'll use something like, 1/125th of a second or 1/250th of a second. And so to do that, I'll rely on the prime lens, bring down the aperture number, and usually I'll also raise up the ISO as well. For those slower scenes, like a cityscape or a suburban landscape, I'll usually put my camera on a tripod, which will allow me to use lower ISOs for a cleaner image, higher aperture numbers for a little bit more depth and a lot more stuff in focus. And then I can just use longer shutter speeds to maintain the exposure, to compensate for how dim the scenes look. Now, I want to again reemphasize at the end of the day, everything we're talking about here is pretty subjective. You can do whatever you want to do. For me, these are just lessons that have helped in my own journey so far. There's no real right way to go about using certain settings or, how you go about shooting. It's really all subjective and up to you and your personal preferences, and you'll kind of figure it out as you experiment with new things. At the end of the day, the one thing that you do need to do is just think about the intention you have for the photo and what the actual scene itself is going to require from you. When I first started out, I found 99% of my locations that I ended up photographing from basically just randomly exploring streets and neighborhoods. I would just drive around at night, and if I saw a street that I hadn't seen before or hadn't gone down in a while, I'd take a quick turn just to see if I could find anything interesting. There was no real plan, no rigid structure to this. It was basically just madness over method, I guess. And now at this point, I still do a good amount of that kind of free exploration, where you're not stressing about time, you're not necessarily worried about what you get out of it. But nowadays, I do have less time to do that. And so I've started to implement more planning, more, methodology to my exploration and my scouting. And that's definitely been fruitful. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I'll do to, just prepare for photo shoots at night and to have a little bit more structure to my sessions when I go out. In recent years, I've really begun to lean on Google, specifically Google Street View and the pins that you can add to Google Maps. It's been really helpful in just organizing potential photo spots to visit and, potential locations that I should check out. One thing that I love is, let's say I'm running an errand and I just see something randomly out the car window or whatever I'm doing, and I don't have time to shoot it then, or maybe it's not the right conditions. I'll just pull over, make a pin of it on Google Maps, and then when I get home later, I can sit down and do a little research on the area. Maybe if the location is like a public thing, there might be photos of it, and I can kind of see what it looks like at certain times of day. And if I think it's worth it, I'll just plan a visit. I'll go out one evening to check it out. I recently did this with a scene that I actually drove by when I was on the way to the gym. It was like an ice cream sign. I saw it in the middle of the day, but I had a feeling that it would light up. So I just pulled over, made a pin on Google Maps, and then when I was able to research it, I actually found that it did in fact light up. Not only did it light up, but it was really interesting. It was a beautiful sign. So I made a quick trip over to it later that week and was able to get a couple of photos. Super stoked on that. And just a good example of how pins on Google Maps can be a really great way for you to organize potential photo locations and just make, a visit to a new spot. Another tool I would recommend is Google Street View for sure. I use this for a lot of my day trips and my road trips. It's awesome because it has photos of so many places. Like I would say most of the United States seems to be covered at this point, for example. And when you're using the Street View and actually looking around and scanning the images, although the images are a little blurry, it gives you a really good idea of what it feels like to actually be there in person, which to me is one of the most important aspects of getting a photo at a potential spot. Is it even worth visiting? Would I even like it there? You can often answer that question, I think, using a tool like Google Street View. So if you haven't played around with that when you're planning a day trip or planning a road trip, it's definitely something I would check out, because for me personally, it's led to a lot of new photos and just a lot of really interesting spots. The work of people like Todd Hido and Greg Girard, Gregory Crewdson, Robert Adams, these are all people that have made incredible bodies of work at night. And for me, a lot of that work, it was probably the root of my inspiration to start night photography myself. With that said, I was also really heavily inspired by a lot of contemporary artists and just people that I saw posting on Instagram. Just off the top of my head, some of the people that inspired me to start shooting at night was Briscoe Park, Christopher Sukup, I think I'm saying that wrong, Henry Prestes, might be saying that wrong as well. I probably gathered a pretty equal amount of inspiration from both those historic bodies of work and people that are just making stuff now. I see a lot of commentary around this topic in the YouTube space especially. People will talk about how important it is to look at books and to focus on, taking your inspiration off of social media. And I do somewhat agree with that idea. I think that too much social media is obviously bad, and a lot of the stuff that people are posting on social media is probably not worthy of giving you inspiration. But I do think if you're following the right people, looking at work that's getting made now, at least on my end, it's pretty insightful to see what people are doing with the world that we have now, what they're able to create. And for me, it's been really motivating to follow other contemporary photographers that are, trying to build bodies of work with these night scenes. Instead of just focusing on one source of inspiration, I would suggest that you allow yourself to be inspired by really just whatever you're interested in. For me, it's sometimes photographers from the past, it's sometimes the newer photographers of the present, it's movies, it's paintings. So whatever gets you interested in this and gets you outside and gets you trying new things, to me, that's all that really matters. So just lean into that, just do what you want to do and don't worry about what other people are thinking about it. That about wraps up what I have for you guys in this episode. If you feel like you got something from this video, I do have a lot more stuff photography related coming to the channel soon. So feel free to subscribe, and then I will see you in the next episode.